Okay, so welcome everyone this morning. Just some housekeeping before we get going. The Zoom will be recorded, so if you want, you can turn your cameras off. You can rename yourself, whatever you need to, but just for some people that's an issue. We will have the chat on. That doesn't, we may, if there are questions, we may only come to them at the end if there's time, but you can put things in the chat if you would like. Please stay muted while Naomi is speaking, unless you ask to unmute. The session is going to be roughly an hour. The other thing you can do if you want to show appreciation is use the little reactions in the bottom to put a little emoji. So that's kind of useful. Okay, so I'm going to invite Naomi to join me here. Welcome,
Thanks.
Naomi. We are very, very happy to have you here this morning. Naomi, are you still home educating or done home educating?
No, I'm still home educating, but they go to a part-time self-directed learning community.
And your background is in clinical psychology, right? And you're still active.
Right, yes.
Not just a background.
I'm not just a background. I am a clinical psychologist.
And that brings some amazing insights. And Naomi's extremely active on Twitter, for which I'm very thankful, because she's fighting the good fight out there in the land of the angry people. So thank you, Naomi. And we're all really looking forward to what you have to share with us today. So I'm not going to waste any more of your time. I'm going to hand over to you.
Thank you, Juliet. I'm going to just try and share my screen. Okay. And I'm going to do the slideshow thing. Okay, so really nice to see you all here. Could somebody just give me a thumbs up to tell me that you can see the screen okay? And it's all, you can hear me. Thanks, Juliet. Okay, so of course, I've got the same problem as I had before. I'm going to just try and move my slides on to get to the first. There we are. So my talk today is called Education Unleashed, Why Learning Doesn't Have to Look Anything Like School. And I'm going to talk a bit about what we think education has to look like and what school tells us education has to look like, and actually what happens, how children learn and how they can become educated when they don't go to school. Because one of the things that happens to many of us when we decide to educate our children differently is that we realize that school provides a kind of roadmap for childhood. It tells us that they're going to go up the steps each time. They'll go from nursery to reception to year 1 to year 2 to year 3, and they'll just keep on going until they get up to year, whatever it is, 11, and they do their GCSEs, and everything seems mapped out. And then when families decide to do something different, it can feel very different. It can feel very much more chaotic, because progress is kind of implied through school simply by moving up those classes. And when families take their children out of school, there's often a real feeling of kind of loss of structure. Well, certainly loss of structure, but also a kind of loss of the basis of how they thought their life was going to look. You know, what does it mean if my children aren't going to go to secondary school when they're 11, for example? What does it mean if everybody else will go into year 1 and we won't go into year 1? How will we structure our own lives? How will we make sense of what they're learning? Because schools are only one way of learning, but most of us are so well schooled that we have real difficulty in imagining any alternative. I know I was definitely like this when I first decided to home educate my children. I kind of imagined that we would do something a bit like school a few years down the line. Not when we started. I could see that when we started, my children were 4 and 1. I could see that we wouldn't be doing anything very much like school at that stage. But I kind of imagined that maybe by the time they were 7 or so, they might want to sit down at a desk and they might want to do the kind of things that children do at school. And I might have to look into curriculums, because I assumed that what happened at school was really education. And often, but this is so deeply in us that we believe that education needs to involve desks and textbooks and tests and even break time or a uniform sometimes. And I know it's really common on the home education Facebooks to see people who are just starting out who've made their lovely home education corner, and it looks very much like a little school classroom. And to me, that's a real sign of just how schooled we all are, of course, because almost all of us went through school, and there we learned that school is necessary for learning. Because there are many ways that we learn at school, and there are many things that are really important that we learn at school. In particular, we learn how to follow an adult agenda and how to take direction. And this is, in fact, a really crucial skill for school, so much so that when I'm involved with writing reports, sometimes I do this for children who are coming out of school, and they have many, many different reports written by all sorts of different professionals about their difficulties and how they need help with this and help with that. And often one of the priorities in the reports is, how can we get this child to take adult direction? Why aren't they taking adult direction in the way we want to? Because it's recognized that if you don't take direction from adult, you're not really going to be able to learn very much at school. You need to learn to ignore your own interests in order to focus on the curriculum. You need to sit still for hours, and that's progressively the case as you go through school. The longer you're there, the more time you have to sit for. The older you are, the more you have to sit. You need to know your place in the hierarchy. I think this is something that many of us aren't even aware that we're learning at school, but you need to know where you are, who you can talk to in different ways. Schools are really complicated social hierarchies. You've got the things you can say to a teacher are not the same as you could say to one of your peers. Then there's teaching assistants, and there might be admin people involved. There's a hierarchy for everything. And there's also a hierarchy within the children, that people are very much segmented into their year groups. There's a real culture of people in the year above being sort of, different, people in the year below being inferior, perhaps, that you know where you fit in that hierarchy. You have to learn to inhibit your impulses to play or to move around, and you have to learn to inhibit your need to ask questions, because at school the only kinds of questions that are valued are either questions that teachers ask children, which are usually not what I would call genuine questions, in the sense that the teacher is trying to test the child to see what they know, rather than a question where the teacher really does want to know what the child thinks about this subject. But questions that are welcome from children are also only on topic. So if you're learning maths and you're suddenly really, really interested in the rainbow that you can see out the window and how it gets there, that's not the time for that question. You have to learn to inhibit that question, because what you're meant to be doing right now is fractions. So these are all skills that children have to learn at school. And they're often skills that we kind of think are important. Children should be able to do these things even when they're out of school. But actually, none of these things are necessary for learning or education, but they are necessary for school. And I've already said that as adults, we consistently confuse, and it's not just us, the government does this, professionals do this, we consistently confuse school with education. So we talk in law, they talk about compulsory school age, but actually it's the compulsory education age. Children need to be receiving a suitable full-time education, but they don't need to be at school. Going to school is always confused with learning. There's such a focus on attendance and of getting children into school, with the idea somehow that just being at school is enough to guarantee learning. So I've talked to families where children are being brought into school to sit outside the classroom and actually do very little, but because it's more important for them to be there and attending than it is for somebody to think, how does this child learn well? Where do they learn best? How could we help them learn? So the system is really focused on getting children into school and then making them do school-like activities. And even if a child is outside school, and say they're on an EOTAS package or something, there's often a focus on trying to get them to do school-like activities. So consistently, we kind of assume that education must look like school. And when evaluating an education, people often look for something like school. And I know that's an issue for lots of people with their local authorities, for example, that local authorities will come in and they want to see a child doing something that looks like school. And so many of us, because we're all members of the same society, this is what we're looking for. And this is the picture that's the classic advert, the classic picture that's used to illustrate articles about home education. A child sitting at the kitchen table, you can see the dishes in the back there, and an attentive parent, and they're following a textbook. So they're essentially doing what this child might be doing at school, but they're doing it at home at the kitchen table instead. And it can be a bit of a surprise to many home educating parents when they take their children out of school, when they discover that actually, when they try to do this, it doesn't work very well. The children don't really want to do it. And it's a very common story that I hear, that parents bring children out of school. They sometimes buy a curriculum. They've got a plan. They think, right, we'll do our school lessons from 9 till 11 every morning, and we'll have the rest of the day to play. It'll be great. And then they find that they get to 9 o'clock every morning and the children are like, no, for the first couple of days, the children are usually up for it. Because it's kind of new and exciting, and now they're doing school at home, and isn't this great? And then about day 3, children start to say, I don't want to do this, I'm not doing it. And then a kind of moment of catalyst, of kind of explosion can occur depending on how the child says this and how the parent reacts. And Alan Thomas actually writes about this in his research really nicely. He talks about it being a kind of scientific process that goes on between the parent and child, where the child starts to say, no, I don't want to do this, and the parent then has to adjust what they do. And they can do that in a number of different ways. And then the child comes in again, and both of them are able to bring their ideas in, which is something that can't really happen at school. Because at school, you've got the teacher who needs to control their class of 30 children or more. Whereas at home, that child's got a lot more power. And therefore, what happens in education is much more of a fusion between what the child wants and the parent brings. Both of them bring things, as opposed to it being a kind of top-down process. Because what parents find is they take their children out of school, they've bought the textbooks, they've maybe got the curriculum, they've set up their home education corner, and then actually they find that what their children want to do is something really quite different. There's often quite a lot of Minecraft involved and video gaming. They often have really all-absorbing interests, but not in things that their parents would have thought of as educational. So these are just a few interests that we've had in our house. Tinkerbell, there's a whole set of movies about Tinkerbell. Pokemon has been an ongoing interest, and My Little Pony was also quite a passion for quite a long time. And all of these are things which I would not have thought about at the beginning. I would not have considered to be education. But this is the way that my children have learned. These are the things that they do. Now, this can often lead lots of parents to feeling really anxious, because they're like, oh, I thought we were going to be doing this. And in fact, what we're doing is playing a lot, playing all the time. And then parents can become really anxious, and then they have a sort of tendency, when we're anxious, we often have a tendency to kind of cling to things we know. So they kind of start saying to things to themselves like, it'll all be fine as long as they learn to read before they're 7. It'll be fine until the end of primary school, but when they get to 11, then it's time for real learning, in quotes. Then they'll say it's fine as long as they do their maths and English, we've just got to stick with that. Or they'll be okay as long as they're going to some classes. If I can just sign them up for something, maybe they can sign up for Khan Academy or do something without school, then we'll be okay. But I can't quite let go of this idea that we're still trying to get them into some kind of school-like structure, because these priorities are really to do with school and not learning. Because learning outside school actually has a very different skill set. So if you remember the skill set I was talking about with school, where you have to learn your place in the hierarchy, you have to inhibit questions if they're not on topic, you have to inhibit your desire to play and move around. Outside school, instead, children need to be asking questions of all types, because that's the kind of fire that starts off their learning. They need to start to trust in their own decisions. They need to think, okay, I'm interested in this and I'd like to do this, or I'm not so interested in that right now, that isn't what I want to do. Whereas at school, that really doesn't matter. If the children are meant to be learning something, it doesn't matter very much if a child says, actually, you know what, I'm not interested in this. In fact, it's a problem if the child does that. Whereas at home, that doesn't have to be a problem, because actually we're wanting children to be able to trust in their own decisions. It's important that children outside school can learn to give things a go without waiting to be told what to do. Again, something that isn't really valued at school at all. They need to evaluate their own progress in their own terms. This is something which sort of surprised me, how much my own children do this, that they'll often show me stuff they've been doing, and they've done an enormous amount of things where they have felt no need for me to see it at all, no need for me to give any input in it at all, because they are progressing on their own terms, and they don't see my evaluation as part of that progress, in the way that children at school are taught to think that their teacher's evaluation is it has to be part of their progress. Outside school, you can move around when you want to, and that's a really important thing for many children. You can relate to all sorts of people on an equal basis. You don't need to buy into this hierarchy of school where you're the child is the person who listens, the adult is the person who instructs. You can tell adults things if you know more than them. And you can ask all sorts of people's questions. I saw this recently, actually. I took my daughter around to the art house. There's like an open art house around here at the moment, and people open their houses and you can buy art that they do. And my daughter's really interested in art. And so we've been going around, and I hadn't even realized that one of the amazing things about it is the artists are all there with their stuff that they do. So we got to talk to somebody who does lots of resin art. We got to talk to somebody who's a painter. We got to talk to somebody who makes felting. And my daughter was really fascinated by this. And one of the artists was telling us about her painting, actually. And my daughter said, I'm an artist too. I work in lots of different media. And the woman was really taken aback by her saying that. She's 10. And she said, oh, what do you do? And my daughter said, well, I'm mostly at the moment working with sewing, but then I also use polymer clay and I paint. And there was just a really nice, she just clearly saw herself on a basis of, let's have this discussion about how different things work. And the artist was really lovely and said to her, yeah, I used to sew like that. What kind of things do you sew? How have you learned to sew? Hardly anybody sews anymore. And they had this really nice conversation. And I could see that my daughter just didn't expect the artist to be kind of in any kind of instructional relationship with her. She was just sharing what she did. Outside school, you could choose to challenge yourself, knowing that you could fail without consequences. I think this is really important, because something that happens at school is we learn that you need to be succeeding. So you need to, and we know from the research that what happens when you tell young people that the outcome is the important thing in their learning is that they choose easy options. So if you know that you're going to be assessed, for example, on your maths, and you've got a choice between easier maths and harder maths, you're probably going to choose easier maths because you think you'll do better. And I remember myself doing this all the way through school. I chose things that I knew I would get better marks with, because for me, the marks were more important than the learning, particularly as you get up the school, by the time you're getting to GCSE or A-level, what grade you're going to get feels so much more important. So I chose to do music GCSE, for example, knowing that I would learn very little doing music GCSE, and actually knowing that I didn't particularly like the teacher and didn't think it'd be very interesting, but that I would almost certainly get an A for that GCSE. And I did. I got an A. But looking back, I think I wish I could have chosen something where I would have actually learned more. Like, I wish I could have chosen art, but I knew at the time that if I chose art, I could well have got a B or a C, and I wasn't going to risk that. So I took music instead. And I think there's something really important about allowing our children to do things, knowing that they don't have to be really good at it. You can do something because you want to learn, even if you're never going to be you're never going to get an A. It doesn't matter. Learning is more important than those grades. It's important to be able to quit when you've had enough. And it's really important to be able to follow your interests. All of these are things that actually aren't really important when it comes to succeeding at school. Because learning at school is essentially a process that goes from teachers to children. The curriculum is set by the teacher and they deliver it to the children, and hope in an ideal world at school, all the children will learn it and they'll all learn a similar thing. Of course, we know that this doesn't happen, and we know that what the child brings to this is really important, and there is actually an interactive process. But the kind of ideal is that the learning is decided by the curriculum, the teacher delivers the curriculum, and the children learn it. Whereas outside school, we put the child in the centre of that instead. And in fact, oddly enough, I thought these arrows were going to be two directional, but they're not. So because I wanted them to be two directional. So I wanted to show that it's not just the child. The child is now able to interact with a whole set of different things in order to learn, but they're also able to there's a sort of two-way process that goes on all the time. So the child, and if you have another child, for example, that other child will introduce things to the child. The adults will introduce things. When children get into books or games or whatever they're doing, there will always be new things being introduced, but it's always an interactive process. So it's never just here it is, learn it. It's always which bits do I want to take out of this? I mean, rather in the way that I use books, I have several bookshelves full of books, particularly for my work, most of which I haven't read all of, I have to admit. Most of which I've read bits of, or I've flicked through them, or I've maybe read the table of contents and maybe read of the first few pages and then the last few pages and some in the middle. But I've learned what I needed to learn from those books. I don't actually need to read the whole book in order to learn it. And I think there's something at school where we learn that we must complete things or it's not worth doing, which I think is very much not the case out of school. But what this can do is that because we have this idea that school has guarantees, parents often get really worried when they hear about children learning in this kind of quite organic way, pulling in things when they're interested, stopping doing things when they're not interested. And we want to see these checklists. We're used to this idea that children will go up the stages, that we'll know that at least they're in year 3 now, so they're doing more than they were in year 2, and they're moving up. And it's hard when that's not there anymore to see where we're going. Because we really need to think of education in quite a different way. And this is part of deschooling, which is the period that parents and children go through when a child comes out of school. And it's often, I think, a more difficult process for parents than for children, because parents have been in school usually for longer than their children. And we need to start thinking of education in a way which isn't comparable to what happens in school. It's not reproducing school at home. It's not linear in the same way. It may focus on an entirely different set of skills to what children would have been learning at school. And it's built on this basis of autonomy and connection rather than on acquiring content. I'm going to unpack that a little bit more. The long haul is something I often say to parents. When we're at school, people want to see progress in small bits. They're like, what progress has this child made this half term or even this week? We need to show progress all the time. When we're doing education outside of school, we don't need to think about it in those terms. And often what we're doing is building the basis with children for doing things much, much later. And if you talk to long-term home educators, they'll talk about how interests come and go over years, and how often they'll be doing something with their children and then they'll kind of lose interest. And then years later, the children will refer back to it and it will become clear that they learn all sorts of things, which at the time they didn't necessarily reveal. It can be highly individualized. And really what children are doing is learning to learn rather than learning content. The curriculum is not the most important thing. The most important thing is that a child feels, if I want to learn something, I can learn about it. And they're learning the skills to do that. When they're younger, it tends to be their parents helping them more with that. And as they get older, they take on more responsibility for that for themselves. But they're always the driver. And a lot of this learning doesn't fit neatly into curriculum boxes at all. So if you ask any home educated parent, generally they'll talk about how children learn so much through outings, through conversations, through all sorts of things. And most of those don't look much like school. So there are so many different ways that they learn. Through conversation is one of these things which I think we really underestimate when our children first come out of school, because of course at school there can't be much genuine conversation, because the ratio of adults to children isn't very big, but also actually school works to kind of stifle conversation. We try and stop children talking to each other. We provide only very limited opportunities for them to really talk. But actually, when we have a freer kind of conversation, people are introducing ideas to each other all the time. And there's so much learning that could go on in a conversation with another child, a conversation with an adult, a conversation with people everywhere, even in the supermarket. All of those conversations can introduce new things to children. With playing is a really, really important part of how we see learning happening. Watching TV, watching YouTube, through observation of others. There's some really interesting research that looks at what happened to children who don't go to school in other countries, because there's very little research that looks at what happens with children who don't go to school in the UK, for example, or the US, because it's just such a small sample that they haven't really done many comparisons. There are some studies by Peter Gray and Gina Riley and Alan Thomas and Harriet Patterson, which look at home education, but there's not much that looks at a kind of comparison of schooled children and unschooled children in how they develop. But there are some studies looking at children in Guatemala who don't go to school, and this is by Barbara Rogoff and colleagues, and she described how these children seem to remain in a state of alert awareness, is what she described. So she compared American children who went to school, Guatemalan children who didn't, and she found that the American children, when they were learning something new, they waited to be told how to do it. They would wait for somebody to instruct them and then they would do it. They didn't even, she had them sort of waiting to learn this thing, I can't remember what it was, but she found that the children who were waiting didn't observe the teacher who was teaching one child at a time. So they only learnt it one-on-one as they did it when it was properly meant to be for them. Whereas the Guatemalan children observed the whole time. She talked about this being a state of alert awareness where they were looking all the time. And so actually, by the time one child had been shown to do it, the other children learned how to do it as well, because they were observing the process. And I see this very much in my own children, that there's a state of kind of awareness of the world, looking out for the world and learning through observation. They can learn through listening, they can experiment, and most of them do experiment all the time in all sorts of different ways. They learn through making mistakes, and they also learn through making choices. And that includes bad choices. People often say to me, well, how do we stop our children from making poor choices? And of course, my answer is you can't. They will make poor choices. And in a way, I think it's good for children to have that the process of learning how to make choice will involve making some choices that their adults might consider to be poor. And that's how they learn. And I would rather my children were getting lots of practice at making choices when they're still children, than that the first time they get to make choices is actually when they're adults, when they're at university, and when the consequences of choices become much more serious. So I think there is a process of being allowed to make choices, for example, like dropping out of something which your parent thinks you'd really enjoy. I allow my children to do that kind of thing, or from not doing something that you think they'd enjoy. That's the classic choice that parents think, I need to make them make this choice because otherwise they will miss out on opportunities. And yes, they will miss out on some opportunities, but they also get the chance to practice and find out what it feels like saying, I don't want to do that. And then afterwards thinking, oh, maybe actually I did. And then maybe the next time around they might choose to do it, or maybe they won't, because maybe actually what you think is an opportunity may not feel like an opportunity for them. So what we're looking for with self-directed education in particular, and home education, I think intrinsic motivation comes into all of it. So intrinsic motivation is when you're doing something because you yourself want to do it. That doesn't mean you're just doing it because it's fun. It doesn't mean you're just doing it from a kind of momentary desire. You can be intrinsically motivated in all sorts of different ways. For example, I was intrinsically motivated to write my book. It took me 2 or 3 years to do so. Nobody told me I had to do it. Nobody made me do it. When I wrote it, I didn't think it would get a publisher. So actually the payoff at the end was pretty minimal in what I turned out, but I wanted to do it. I was really driven to do it. It would not have made any difference to me if somebody had said, oh, if you write a book, we'll give you a prize at the end if we think it's good enough. That would have been introducing extrinsic motivation. Or if somebody had said, when you write your book, we'll grade it for you. And if you do really well, then we'll give you a GCSE or a certificate, or maybe, I don't know, some other kind of degree. That would have made absolutely no difference. And in fact, I think it might have put me off. If I thought someone was going to read that book at the end and grade it, I would have felt quite differently about it. In fact, one of the only ways I could write my book was saying to myself, probably no one is ever going to read this. And it really doesn't matter. It's, you're writing it for you. You're writing what you want to say. So what we're doing with children is we're trying to help them maintain this sense of intrinsic motivation, which all young children are born with. You can see it in the way that they learn when they're young. They learn things because they're interested. They learn things because they want to know. They explore, they ask questions, they play. It's exhausting being with them for that very reason. And they learn so quickly. And then what happens when we go into school is we take away that drive that they have, because we stop allowing them to learn through their interests. Because the research shows that intrinsic motivation has 3 main factors that it needs in order to be kind of there, in order to be really flourishing. And those things are autonomy, or the space to make decisions about your life. Those are meaningful activities and opportunities to learn. So opportunities to do things that you feel good when you're doing. And then it's also supportive relationships. Now, school doesn't work on this premise. It doesn't give children the space to make meaningful decisions about what they're doing. So, and it doesn't necessarily, when they say meaningful activities and opportunities at school, those are meaningful in terms of being defined by the adults, the curriculum. So they're not necessarily meaningful for the individual children. So once that's happened, once we've put children in an environment which doesn't nurture their intrinsic motivation, and where they haven't really got the space to exercise that, and this is something that happens gradually at school, because actually nurseries and receptions classes do have space usually for children to show that, to be able to discover things. They are set up for children to make choices. Unfortunately, the further we get through the school, the fewer choices children generally have. So once we've done that, then schools need to bring in extrinsic motivation instead, to get children to do things, because they've lost this sort of power of intrinsic motivation because the circumstances aren't set up for that. So this is when schools bring in rewards and punishments, they bring in grades, they bring in praise, approval. They try deliberately to make children dependent on extrinsic motivation to get them to learn. And that's what teacher approval, that's what putting children's names up on the board when they do well or badly is all about. It's about extrinsic motivation. And unfortunately, the research shows that that isn't as good for learning as intrinsic motivation. It shows that you can get people to go through the motions of learning, but you can't make them want to do it. So the difference is quite profound, really. I think one of the ways I think about it is it's like with writing lines. I don't know if anybody here had to write lines at school. I was given lines a few times to write, and I had to write the same line out 100 times or as more than that as a punishment. And I was doing it. I had to do it. I was forced to do it. I went through the motions of doing it. But I didn't want to learn anything. I mean, it was set up as a task that I wouldn't learn anything through. But it's very different. My son at the moment is practicing his handwriting because he wants to improve his handwriting, and he is copying out lines again and again and again because he wants to learn his handwriting. So he's doing the same task as I had to do back then, but for him, it has a purpose and a meaning, and he's chosen to do it. And that makes it an entirely different task. So what we're working with is that we want this intrinsic motivation because it's the spark which really sets their learning alight. And this is something which out of school we can do, we can prioritize. And once we've done that, then what we need is an environment of opportunities for children to learn within. So, because once we've got that intrinsic motivation, there are so many things that come from that if the opportunities are there. So children will do so many different things, but they'll also learn in so many different ways. And this will look very different as they grow. So this is a young child who's obviously intrinsically motivated to learn how to do the monkey bars. And again, I'm guessing that if they'd said, you know, have a reward for this if you manage it, it probably wouldn't make much difference to his skill acquisition. It might make him nervous about doing it. It might make him feel he's got to stick with it, even if he wants to stop. But it wouldn't the research shows it doesn't make a difference to the skill acquisition to put a prize at the end. In fact, it can demotivate people because when they don't get the prize, then that feels like a punishment. So even if he does the monkey bars once and at the end they give him a lollipop or something because they say, well done, you've done it, then the next time he does it, he'll be looking for that lollipop again because it's been linked with the activity. And what they find is that actually when you reward children for doing an activity that they are intrinsically motivated to do, so say like doing the monkey bars here, when you stop rewarding them, they are less likely to carry on doing that activity. So they did these studies with preschoolers where preschoolers drawing, because preschoolers like drawing, these are young children, and they gave half of the children a prize for their drawing. I think they gave them stickers or something. And actually at the time, they thought that the stickers would increase the children's quality of drawing and also that they would do more drawings. What they found was that while they gave them the stickers, yes, they carried on doing it. But when they stopped giving them the stickers, the group who'd been given the stickers did fewer drawings, whereas the group who were never given stickers carried on drawing because they liked drawing. And that was the reason they were doing drawing. So it shows that even in an activity that children enjoy and are intrinsically motivated to do, when you shift that focus to extrinsic motivation, you can damage their internal drive, their intrinsic motivation. So that's another thing that we try not to do as home educators, to give them that chance to do what the things they're interested in without putting an adult agenda in there. So what does that actually mean in practice? Well, it means that the way that we see education out of school and learning out of school is very different to how schools think of learning. So these are just a few things that I found on the internet looking at schools, and it basically lists of what your child should be able to do at each stage. And this needs to know thing at the top here is, you can see it's this idea that they will continue to learn things in a kind of linear fashion, and that is what we're looking for. We're looking for things building each time we're learning something new, and we can predict what those children are going to learn from the outside. that this is something that you can't do if you're going to allow children to be intrinsically motivated, because once you do that, once you say this is the thing you have to learn, you've already taken away the chance for them to make meaningful choices. This makes lots of parents really worried. And lots of them will say, well, how do we know how when they're progressing if we haven't got these checklists? We can't tick off what they should be doing. We can't think, right, that's good, we've finished year 1 curriculum, now we can move on to year 2. Well, the one thing we know is that there are no linear trajectories. Well, there are very few, but most children do not follow linear learning trajectories. School kind of gives the illusion that they do because they move up the year groups. But actually, if you look at what all those individual children are learning and doing, there'll be massive variation in each class, and some of those children will be not making very much progress at all for a long time and then might make dramatic progress. Some of them might make dramatic progress for a bit and then make much slower progress. Some of them just seem to be learning stuff all over the place, and I think it helps to bear this in mind that all of these children are learning. It's happening, but it doesn't look like this line on the left where we've got this nice diagonal pattern. But there are some broad patterns that we can see in our children who are home educated. We see that play often goes on for years longer than in school children. So what happens in school is you're allowed to play for the first couple of years. There's often play-based learning. By the time you get into year 1 and year 2, play-based learning is significantly reduced and sitting at your desk is valued more highly. Formal learning is valued higher than informal learning, and that means really the curriculum coming from the teacher. And what we see with children outside school is that they continue in that moving quickly from topic to topic learning phase much longer. So this is called the discovery phase of learning. So it's when children are learning because of their curiosities right then in the moment. So they might be playing with something. They're not really necessarily interested in developing any kind of skills. They're not really thinking about the future. They're not setting themselves goals. They're not thinking things like, I really, really want to get much better at drawing, so I'm going to practice my drawing. They're drawing because they love drawing. Or they build things with Lego because they love building things with Lego. They do what they really enjoy. And through doing that, they do learn things. They learn loads of things, but they're not doing it in the way that school sees learning. So they're not necessarily deliberately setting about to improve their skills. And they're often not very interested in producing something, because actually for them, it's all about the process and flow. So I remember when I took my son to stay and plays when he was very young, about 2, we would go and do the painting. There would be like a painting table, and there would always be some product that you were meant to be doing. And it was often crowns, or sometimes it was a picture of a particular thing. And you would see all these parents trying to kind of push their children towards producing the product that they were meant to be doing. And then you would see the children who weren't really interested in the product, who were much more interested in, can I stick my hands into this paint, and can I make handprints everywhere, and can I paint the table? Or actually the thing my son used to do was he really, really liked mixing up the different messy play opportunities. So there would often be like a tough spot on the floor with oats in it. And what he really, really wanted to do was mix the paint with the oats, which wasn't something that the Stay and Play staff had anticipated. And actually, so what I was doing a lot of time was trying to control his interaction with what was going on. And I remember thinking, why is it that messiness is so much messier at home? And of course, it was because I wasn't controlling it in quite the same way. So at home, if I got out paint and oats, then we would mix the paint and oats pretty quickly, and we would not be producing any nice crowns, which they could put up on the wall. So you get this strange situation, and you can see it in pretty well every nursery classroom, where the adults are trying to push the children into doing a product. Often this means that the adults do a lot of the work. So you get pictures home which actually quite clearly the adult has drawn, or the adult has done the colouring in, because the child just isn't interested. So from very early on, we've got adults trying to push children towards a different way of learning, away from this play-based, quite chaotic discovery phase of learning, because they think that later phases of learning are superior. They think that formal learning is where we really learn. Now, there is a different kind of learning, and it's something that we see in home educated children as they get older. But from my observations, and there isn't research on this, as far as I know, from my observations with home educated and self-directed children, it isn't usually until they're getting to the age of about 10 or 11 that their learning starts to change. And what I mean by change then is that they start to it starts to become more deliberate and more intentional. So they start to set themselves goals about things. They start to say, right, I want to do this. And because I want to do this, I'm going to do all these other things. I'm not saying they actually say that. I'm saying somewhere in their brains, it looks like they're saying that. So rather than it just being about, right, I want to play now with my scooter, it might be, I want to learn how to do a trick on my scooter and I'm going to practice so I do it. Or they might start seeking out new opportunities for themselves. They start accessing different ways to learn and they develop skills and knowledge. And this is what's called the mastery phase of learning. And this is something that schools try to impose on children. So schools try to make children practice things, for example. They effectively make them practice things. And what I think is really interesting, what I've seen in my own children and other children around me, is that with self-directed children who aren't made to practice, they start doing it themselves, but much later, so maybe 11, 12, or even a bit older than that, but also they don't necessarily practice the things that the school would have wanted them to practice. So they put this kind of new way of learning into action, perhaps with video games, or perhaps with Dungeons and Dragons, or perhaps with learning how to climb or ride their bicycle. They don't necessarily apply it to mathematics or English literature. But the point about self-directed and home education is that we're helping them. What's important is that they're doing this, that they are learning a different way to learn, because they can apply that to other ways of learning as and when they want. And we know that as children reach adolescence, their brains go through an intense period of development. And in fact, neuroscientists are saying now that it might be another period of intense vulnerability, just like early childhood is, where children at that point have got massive learning potential, but they're also very vulnerable to things going wrong. So if you can get things right in that early period, it helps children learn later on. And neuroscientists like Sarah Jane Blakemore are saying that actually during adolescence, there's another period where if we can get things right, it really can help children do better. And it can give them, those who didn't get such a great chance the first time around, a second chance. But they say that adolescence goes on a lot longer than we think it does. So in terms of brain development, when they've done scans, they've found that brain development goes on from the age of about 10 through to the age of 24 or 25. So there's still neurological development going on in that stage. And of course, we continue to learn and develop after that period as well, but there's a particular period of intense change around this time. And the two parts of their brain that particularly developing at this time are the social reward system. So they become much more focused on their peers and on social belonging. But at the same time, the self-control system in their brains is developing. So this is the bit that enables them to set goals and to think about the future. And in fact, when we're trying to impose this on children younger, we're really trying to impose it on children whose brains are not yet at the point where they're able to work that way. So it is very much something adults have to make children do. Whereas when we come to adolescence, this is something that they can learn to do. But the kicker is that this part of the brain, the self-control part, is experience dependent. It's not something which just emerges, like with everything in our brains develop in an acutely sensitive interaction between our environment and our genes. So it's not the case that children will simply become able to do these things without the experiences that they need. So what we're hopefully doing for our children outside school is we're giving them loads of opportunities to practice controlling themselves, to practice setting goals for themselves, to practice making mistakes for themselves, to practice all these things for themselves, which will enable their brains to develop in the way that they need to. And Alison Gopnik is in her book, The Gardener and the Carpenter, writes about this. And she says that schools really don't provide the right environment for this maturation to happen. So that, centuries ago, children in mid to late childhood, they would have been doing tasks. They would have been learning to do. They would have been maybe starting to cook things, or they would have been caring for younger children. They would have been doing actual tasks, which meant that they had to practice these skills. But when we put children in a school environment and we take all their choices away from them, they don't actually have the same opportunities to practice these skills of self-management, because at school we consistently confuse complying with the demands of somebody else, complying with what teachers want you to do, with self-management. So we say that a child is able to manage themselves well if they do what the teacher says, or if they're able to sit still when the teacher says. But actually, those aren't skills of self-management. Those are skills of accepting somebody else's management. Self-management is more about, I'm sitting down and I feel, gosh, I really need to go and run around now because my body really needs to get some energy out, and being able to go and do it. Or self-management is saying, right, I would really like to learn about this, so I'm going to do it, rather than sitting and waiting for somebody else to tell you what to do. The skills that we think of as self-control for children are actually often skills that are only really useful in that particular period of being schooled, between maybe the ages of 5 and 16. And then once we've done that to children, we've taught them to give somebody else the responsibility for all this and to comply, we then start saying, now's the time when you need to take control of your education, now's the time when you need to know what choices you want to make. And then very often, many young people don't have much clue by that stage. By the time they're 16, 17 or 18, it's really hard for them to make those decisions because they've spent their whole childhood not making them. They've spent their whole childhood being told what you're interested in matters less than what the teacher thinks you should be learning. So what we see in our self-directed young people and our home-educated young people is that as they become teenagers, they are interested in so many things, and their learning becomes very efficient. And it's really surprising. I've been really surprised at what home-educated teenagers do and what they're learning. I think when my children were younger, I heard people saying things like, oh, they're learning Russian, or they're learning engineering, and I was kind of like, yeah, right, I can't really see that happening to my children who are just learning about slime and Lego. But now we've got to those teenage years, I can see that their peers are learning all sorts of things. I know young people who are completely off their own bat learning Chinese. I know young people who are learning how to code. I know young people who are studying advanced mathematics. I know young people who are learning Russian. I know young people who are learning a whole range of things, which actually I would not have anticipated that they would have been interested in. But but why wouldn't they be, actually? Because their intrinsic motivation hasn't been damaged. So they are fascinated by learning, and everything is interesting. And therefore they learn. And it's very efficient because, of course, there's no time wasted in trying to make them interested or trying to persuade them to do it. So this change can be seen as we look back over the years, but it's not necessarily very easy to see from day to day, which can be really hard for parents, particularly during these years of middle to late childhood, sort of 6 to 12, when often home-educated children might seem to be quite uninterested in learning to do the things that school children are doing at that stage. But there is no critical period for the acquisition of these skills. People often believe there is. They often say, if you haven't learned to read by the time you're 7, it's going to be much harder. It isn't. And for some children, it's a lot easier. Of course, what happens at school is that if you haven't learned to read by 7, then generally you've had quite a few years of reading instruction that you haven't learned by. And so what you've often learned is that you are no good at reading, or you've learned that you are a failure. And all those things will definitely make it harder to learn how to read later on. So, but if a child isn't learning those things, and there's no reason for them to have to learn that, and Harriet Patterson, her research shows this actually, that home-educated children learn to read at all sorts of different ages, and it doesn't have the baggage that learning to read at a different stage has for school children, because it just seems much more natural that some children learn to read when they're 10, some learn to read when they're 4, and that doesn't have to mean anything about them. It doesn't have to mean anything about their value or their worth as a person, whereas at school it often is thought to be like that. So what do we do instead of providing this curriculum for children? What do we do instead of the checklists? Well, we need to offer opportunities, but not obligations. We need to join the children where they are rather than where we wish they were. And if you want to track progress, I'd suggest just making notes for yourself, maybe just a day in the life type of diary once a month. Find other home educating families to talk to so that the comparisons are not always with school children. And ask yourself how you feel when someone insists you do something or makes you do it. Does it make you want to do it more? Does it make your learning better? And then look for their curiosity and follow that. And I'm just going to finish off with a little example of what it can look like in our house sometimes. This is actually an example from my daughter a couple of years ago, and it was before she was really reading or writing. So the things I see in my children, and I'll talk about those in this example, is I see curiosity, a gradual change over time. There's an ability to say no to things. That can also go with the ability to say yes. There's some enthusiasm, self-reflections sort of gradually coming into play, connections being made, and there's opportunities for them. They can see opportunities and they're creating them as well. So this is something my daughter was very interested in a few years ago. She was interested in Pusheen, the cartoon cat, and I have no idea where she found this interest in Pusheen, but it was quite obsessive for a while. It was basically all she was interested in. So she and I would do internet searches together for more information about Pusheen. We would draw pictures of Pusheen. There are quizzes you can do about Pusheen online. You can find out what kind of Pusheen you are. We would do those together. We made some models. In fact, we made several Pusheen houses where we've made lots and lots of different models of Pusheen, and then she made a cardboard house and she put them all in. She sewed her own Pusheen plushies. We wrote some stories about Pusheen, and by writing, I mean she dictated them to me and I wrote them down. And we would go to the shops. Claire's Accessories has a special Pusheen section, and we would go and have a look, and she would save up her money in order to buy Pusheen plushies. So, and this was just narrowing down into kind of one of the conversations we had about Pusheen. So this is showing how there's a kind of interaction between what I was introducing and what she was bringing in. So she was saying, what can we do? And I suggested to her, how about if we write our own Pusheen quiz? And I know her interests, so that's why I suggested it. She was keen on this idea. So she said, yes, we could do that in a book, and I'll get the paper. So she went and got a bit of paper and made a little book. And then she said to me, you write the questions and I'll do the choices. So I said, what questions would you like? And she said, what gift would you choose? So I wrote it down. How many options shall we have? And I suggested 4, or was it she that suggested 4? I can't remember. One of us suggested 4. And we would then we started coming up with all sorts of questions. She got excited about this idea. She said, I know we can give each answer a question at the end. Each answer a number. People have to add them up. We talked about what numbers. She asked me how we wrote some things. She wasn't really writing at this stage. And we talked about different words and how to make the book. And then this is our Pusheen quiz book that we've made. So this is my writing here, the Pusheen quiz book, where I've put what dessert do you like? And then she has actually herself written in the words underneath, and then she's given the answers all numbers, if you can see in the little boxes, so that we could add up the different numbers and that we could give people the Pusheen quiz book. And then we did this, and then as you can see, in fact, she kind of lost interest, and so we stopped doing it. So the what dessert do you like never got the words, never got the A and the B's and the C's. We just did it this far, and then that was fine, and then we moved on. And all of our children are going to be creating these kind of networks of learning all the time. So you can see how this Pusheen sort of spark started linked to all sorts of different other things. It's linked to writing, it's linked to numeracy, it's linked to food, talking about nutrition, it's linked to all sorts of things. And that's exactly what we see with self-directed education, that you have a nub of an interest and it spreads to so many other things. So I'd like you to encourage you to just think about what kind of connections are your children creating right now when they're interested in things. What sorts of things are they enjoying, and how are those connections being made? And how can you be involved in those connections rather than coming and saying, come on, we should be doing something else over here? Because I'd like to finish off by saying that education just doesn't have to look anything like school. And as parents who were schooled, we often confuse learning with schooling. And home educated children have a lot more power than school children. And so if parents are able to work with that, their education is more individualized, more child-led, and led by interest. And here are a few books I would recommend having a look at if you're interested in any of these ideas. I'd particularly recommend the first one, Troublemakers by Carla Shalaby, which is a really, really good way to think about school in a slightly different way. Okay, thank you, everybody. I'm going to stop sharing and I'm going to see if there are any questions.
Thanks, Naomi. I must say, one of the things I said in our opening, I gave the definitions of bold, free, and loud, because our conference is titled, or the theme is bolder, freer, louder. Mm-hmm. To be free is to be able to act according to your autonomous will in consequence of not being dependent on the will or goodwill of anyone else. And I think this autonomy, we can actually impose restrictions and impose on that freedom just as much as any other environment institution can. And there was a discussion on one of the home educating groups that I'm on where somebody was saying how, we own our children, because this is in defense to the government, so they don't own our children, we do. But actually, we don't own our children. That would make them slaves.
Yeah,
and I think
absolutely.
it's to me, they're on loan to us. We have a very, very important job to do, to nurture them towards a whole and healthy, happy adulthood. But we can't own them, because that, as I say, would make them slaves. And home education offers such a huge amount of freedom, and we shouldn't really waste it. We've got an amazing opportunity. So I'm going to just see if there are any questions in the chat. So we've got lots of comments here, and I'm just trying to make it bigger so I can read it better. Okay, let's start from the top. Oh, okay. By the way, I have put some of those links that Heidi put in the chat early on, like onto Naomi's speaker profile, the link to her where you can get a book. Rosie asked, how do you encourage intrinsic motivation in asynchronous children? My son is a sponge for many things, and by any standard is doing great, but he's also a perfectionist, and so is extremely self-critical. I have ensured that I only give specific praise and ask him how he feels about things he's made, rather than giving my opinion. So he values his opinion rather than mine. I wonder if there are any other useful ways I can encourage his intrinsic motivation. Most things I've found are aimed at schooled children.
Oh, that's a big question, Rosie.
It is a big question.
I think self-criticism can be part of some children's process. And I would reflect on that with them. So I would basically say, if a child is being really self-critical, I would probably say something like, yeah, sometimes it's really hard, isn't it, to do something and then wish you'd done it better. So I wouldn't try and push them away from that self-criticism, but I would also just reflect on it being part of their process, and maybe say to them things like, it's really hard sometimes to know when something's good enough and when you can stop. And one of the things I often say to parents is, talk about your own process, because the moment it's about them, it feels like pressure. So if you're a perfectionist too, and if you've been self-critical in the past, I would talk about that. I would say things like I say I'm doing about my writing, I might say things like, it's really hard for me to say, this is good enough, rather than just to keep on trying to get it better. Or I might say, sometimes I feel really like I wish I'd done that better, and see if you can get a kind of conversation about it, which isn't just about them, but is about you, about this process as well. And you might find that they give you advice as well. With the thing about only giving specific praise, do you mean that basically you'll say, you don't praise him, is that right? You praise what he's done. So you wouldn't say, are you there, Rosie?
Rosie, you're welcome to pop up.
Hi. Sorry, I've got a sleeping baby, so if
sorry.
crying, then
yeah.
Yeah, so I will try and rather than just saying, oh yeah, that's great, and kind of leave it at that, I'll say, oh, you've done I don't know, let's say it's a picture. Oh, that's a really interesting color.
I really like
why have you chosen that?
Yeah.
I can see that's this thing. Why did you do it that way? Rather than trying to just, oh yeah, kind of almost dismissed. Yeah, that's great. Fine, move on, kind of thing.
Yeah,
that makes sense.
Yeah. Yes. No. I see what you mean. It's tricky, because I don't know about what your son, but I think I read Alfie Kern about doing that kind of thing when my children were younger. I found that sometimes my children really, really wanted me to say, this is amazing, this is exceptional. And also and I felt like we were almost in a struggle where they were like, come on. And I was giving my specific praise about it. So I think sometimes if you're authentic about it, it's fine to say, I think that is really good. But also I think it's sometimes important to say, I wonder if you could have done that bit a bit differently. Do you know what I mean? So that you're kind of, so that they know that your opinion is genuine, rather than simply good job kind of thing. Yes, but I suppose the other ways, it sounds like he does have intrinsic motivation, and I think it can be part of some children's process that they're really critical of themselves. But I would just make that out in the open, that that's part of how that is part of many people's process.
Yeah, it's definitely how I am. So
okay, well, there you are then.
I see it reflected, and I think, I don't want you to feel like that sometimes, and it's sort of trying to fix myself through him sometimes, and I have to try and stop myself.
That's so interesting, and that is exactly what happens, isn't it? We think, I don't want my child to have to go through that. I went through it. I want it to be different for them. But I would, in a way, if you do it, then that's great. Talk about it, make it something that is out there. Everybody, rather than something that he feels he shouldn't be doing, because that will make it more of a problem.
Yes.
You see what I mean?
Great. Yes. Thank you very much. Thank you.
I would often say to my kids is, look, I want you to step away from it for a bit. Come back and look at it later and think about it again, and you might see it differently, but just the other thing I think was, we live in a society, particularly in school, where failure is seen as a bad thing. And I'm trying to help my children to understand that it's okay to make mistakes, that mistakes are how we learn. They're actually very powerful ways to learn. And I think it takes a bit of a shifting, but it's how you pass that on to your child without saying, like, if you say it in the wrong way, then it could come across as, oh, you're saying I made a mistake. You're saying I failed, and actually that's not what you're wanting to say. You're trying to say to them, well, this is a great learning curve, a great thing for you to kind of think about and think how you could do it differently and all of that. We've got, I'm going to just take one more question, because we've got to use the Zoom for another thing, brief in for the lunchtime. So we've got lunchtime chatting tables in the lounge. Basically, you can go and choose a topic and go and just join a table for a chat.
Can I just answer about Tom Hill's just got a quick question?
Yes,
about
that's the one I was going
to. Great. I would suggest reading the book Drive by Daniel Pink, which summarizes all of the research on intrinsic motivation. It's a popular science book. It's great. I really enjoy it. And at the end, he says self-directed education is, I think it's quite funny, because it's a very conventional, it's not a home ed book at all, but it's about intrinsic motivation. And at the end, he actually comes down quite strongly on the side of self-directed education as the way that does, so I would recommend reading that.
Yeah, the question, Tom, that I was going to refer to is one where he says, we're living in this environment right now where people are pushing this approach of more school. We've got a problem, so what do we do? Throw more school hours, younger age and everything. And we've got to navigate that brick wall thinking. Have you got any advice on how we, she says, I'm just trying to think what is, but any advice, for navigating that brick wall thinking?
The brick wall thinking, it's very challenging, isn't it? The way I deal with it is I say that I'm taking an evidence-based approach to education, because there's a lot of buzz at the moment about evidence, which is one of the reasons I talk about research. And actually the evidence-based education that they talk about in school is actually there's much less evidence for it than you would think there is. But also it's a bit like what I'm saying here. I'm taking an evidence base about intrinsic motivation, which was not designed for self-directed education. Okay, it's a whole body of research that's about self-direction, autonomy, intrinsic motivation. And I'm saying we can apply that to self-directed education. That is what they're doing in school as well. They're taking these cognitive theories and they're saying we can apply these to education, although actually there aren't very many studies about whether we can do that. So I do something similar, and I say this is an evidence-based approach. This is how we're doing it. We are maximizing autonomy, competence. You'll see it in the book, in Daniel Pink's book, and I'm just confident about it. And but I can't tell you what an LA will accept, because I know that they're changing their rules all the time. But I do think we have to be confident in what we're suggesting. We have to try not to be honing what we do into the school parameters, because then we start to look like a weaker, less good version of school. And, there are other school curriculums. There's Montessori, there's Steiner, which take a different approach to learning and which are able to do that. So in Steiner, they don't teach children to read at 5, for example. That's part of their philosophy. So I would say part of my philosophy of self-directed education is that we don't teach children to read at 5. Children learn to read at a wider thing, and so my children are doing this in exactly the way I would expect, so that you show that you are thinking this through, rather than it being what they will think it is, which is doing nothing. So you say this is a research-based approach, this is how I'm doing it, this is how I'm nurturing their intrinsic motivation, these are the opportunities I'm providing for them. And for mapping progress, what I do suggest people do is do a day in your life every so often, because there will be change and there will be progress. If you do it a year ago and you write all the things down you're doing, don't, you know, not like maths, but like, you know, we spent this time playing Lego, or we spent this time you'll see change, and then you can write about it.
Yeah, and I actually had a son that I used to let him do 3-day Lego marathons, and I know that there was a lot of learning going on. I couldn't have written down on paper exactly what it was, but huge strides in his learning. I mean, there's what I might actually do is just save the chat and see if we can answer some of those questions in some way. But Naomi has, you can follow the link to find out how to get hold of her book, Changing Our Minds.
Yeah, I also talk about the evidence in there as well.
I mean, Naomi, it's actually always such a pleasure, and I just I really enjoy your, you know, following your thinking, because you articulate the things that sometimes I battle to find words for. You put it really well, and just keep up with that Twitter battle there. We're behind.
Thank you.
And you know, go and follow Naomi on Twitter, and yeah, there's just so much. I mean, we'll have to do more with you, get more and more of this out there, because yeah, I don't know what's going on with the world at the moment. It just, none of it makes sense to me. The way people are reasoning, the logic just doesn't work. So thank you very much. We are heading off to lunchtime tables shortly, and then start back with sessions at 2 p.m. And we've got some good ones. We've got the civil liberties one coming up at 2, which is going to be good. And also, for those who are interested, why Jen Richardson walked and her family walked around Anglesey for home education. So thank you very much, everyone, and see you around.
Bye.